This community, like many others, have been impacted and will be traumatized and working through grief for a long time. But we, alongside our federal government partners, will be doing it together to make sure that the community can continue their road to recovery.
Hey DheGrio fam, it's Gerren Keith Gaynor, White House correspondent and managing editor of politics at TheGrio, and I'm here with Marcus Coleman, who is the director of the DHS Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Director Coleman, welcome to TheGrio. Pleasure to have you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for having me.
Mississippi residents, as you know, have been devastated by the recent tornado that hit parts of Mississippi. Homes have been destroyed, businesses have been destroyed, and it's my understanding that you, along with other officials in the Biden-Harris administration, have been on the ground tending to the needs of those who have been impacted. Could you first describe to me how that damage looks like on the ground, particularly from your firsthand perspective?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, right, President Biden provided an expedited disaster declaration or request, or approved an expedited request to help individuals and families begin their process to recovery. And we're encouraging anybody that has friends and family in Mississippi that's been impacted, or maybe you're listening to this and have been impacted yourself, to dial 1-800-621-3362 or visit disasterassistance.gov to jumpstart your road to recovery from the federal resources. I did join FEMA Administrator Chris Well and the Secretary for Homeland Security, and we met with Congressman Benny Thompson, the governor of Mississippi, the other senators from the congressional delegation, and we met directly with disaster survivors in Rolling Fork, Mississippi. And just heartbreaking and devastating to see the damage. It was lost homes, lost businesses, impacted communities, but to see the community coming together. Organizations ranging from Delta Sigma Theta to Alpha Kappa Alpha to the Masons, providing food, water, coming alongside the Red Cross for people that needed shelter, is one of the encouraging signs that this community, like many others, have been impacted and will be traumatized and working through grief for a long time. But we, alongside our federal government partners, will be doing it together to make sure that the community can continue their road to recovery from these devastating storms.
And as you mentioned, President Biden did issue a disaster declaration, obviously to help supplement some of that support on the state and local level. Could you describe what that support looks like in terms of how that will materialize for these residents who have been impacted by this tornado?
I appreciate the question. It's something that unfortunately is happening a little bit more frequently as a result of climate change in terms of these presidential declarations. So what this particular declaration request does for individuals, for families, for people, it provides an opportunity for them to access direct assistance, both from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Small Business Administration. It is very important if you have been impacted by this disaster to call 1-800-621-3362 or visit disasterassistance.gov, because that's going to jumpstart a process, not just for FEMA resources, but for resources from other federal agencies over time as well. In addition, we also know that many of the individuals and families might also be business owners. And so what this disaster declaration request does is helps FEMA organize the federal family. So we're talking about the Small Business Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and others. FEMA is working closely with our interagency partners because we know that the needs of these families is intersectional, right? It's not just going to be impacts from the tornado, it's the emotional impacts. It's going to be access to medication. And those two things our colleagues at Health and Human Services focus on. It's going to be about helping children navigate, again, the disruption in their lives, which is where our Department of Education comes into play. It's going to be about, again, these are mostly rural communities. And so the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Department of Commerce are going to play a very large role in these communities. And of course, it's going to be about housing. Housing and urban development is one of our key partners. Every step of the way, the Biden-Harris administration is going to ensure that we're making every federal resource available. And this is consistent with how we approach every single disaster here under this administration and through the agency. We want to make sure that we're keeping people first. We know that that's intersectional, and we know that that requires an interagency response. And that's what FEMA Administrator Chris Well is committed to do at the direction of President Biden.
I know your role specifically is about partnerships with faith-based organizations. And I remember there was a report about the recent a tornado in Mississippi, and there was a church that was not destroyed during the tornado, and that church has been a refuge for those who have been impacted, for the victims. Can you speak more to the role of the church and faith-based organizations, because they play such a major role whenever we see these type of devastations that unfortunately is becoming more common than we would like?
Absolutely. And you're right. We see faith organizations across the board standing up and making sure that they're engaging folks. Yes, there was a Methodist church in Rolling Fork, and there are several churches from the Baptist to Church in God in Christ to United Church of Christ and other faith organizations all stepping up. But I know that there was a pretty large gathering. I believe it was at the Methodist Church in Rolling Fork. And again, this is happening in counties across affected areas in the state of Mississippi. So I think when we talk about the role of just the faith community broadly, it can show up like providing that very invaluable emotional and spiritual care, that presence and solace. It can literally be serving as a shelter. Our disaster survivor assistance teams that are on the ground in Mississippi, they're going to be going to churches. They're going to be going to other places and community spaces because we know that's where the people are. And we're going to continue to meet people where they are. Our disaster survivor assistance team members will go to churches. They'll help register survivors there. If there are people that are going to the church for food, water, shelter, we're going to get them registered again. For those that aren't able to get to those places and spaces, our disaster assistance teams are also going to be looking to our faith and community leaders because they know the context of communities. As I said, when I was in Rolling Fork, when I saw some very familiar organizations from the National Panhellenic Council, the Masons, and others, one of the things I knew for sure is that they knew where their friends and neighbors were if they weren't in the shelters with friends and family members. And so we know that churches, Church of God in Christ, National Baptist Convention, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and others are going to be very important partners, and they always have been when people need them most post-disaster.
And, it goes without saying that many of these victims, those who have been impacted, are Black and brown. Majority of these counties are Black, and also low income. Rebuilding, I can imagine, could take potentially years. Can you speak to the difficulty when communities of color are impacted by these type of natural disasters?
Happy to, and this is a place where I deeply appreciate the GRIO and your leadership. As some of you may know, we actually had an op-ed penned recently about what I've learned from Black leaders post-disasters, and there we were able to talk about just the unique positioning and role that Black-led organizations and Black leaders have to understanding the real impacts of climate change and of climate resilience. It's a long road to recovery, and I think as many of us know, there are no easy answers. We still have people recovering from the tornadoes in Selma, people recovering from the tornadoes in Mayfield, Kentucky, and of course now in Mississippi. There's a lot of complexities for a whole new set of folk. But one of the things that I know to be true is we also have leaders like John Hope Bryant from Operation Hope. What he knows about recovery is that people need support to navigate the financial aspects of it. So his nonprofit Operation Hope provides free disaster financial counseling. What we know about leaders like Chauncey O. Willis, the president and CEO of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, she's an emergency manager that fully understands that, again, our response and recovery efforts must be intersectional. And then what we're learning from other faith leaders across the country, like Reverend Naomi Washington Leaphart, who is the City of Philadelphia's faith advisor, what she knows and what she brings to the discussion is that when we talk about intersectionality and recovery, it's got to be for all people, including those from the LGBTQTIA community. And we know that these folks are all over the country. And we got to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to come alongside our faith and community leaders that understand those nuances well. And so, again, as we think about recovery on the federal side, we're committed to an interagency response, U.S. Department of Agriculture, FEMA, Housing and Urban Development, Small Business Administration, but we're equally committed to the national coalition of partners, including those I mentioned earlier, and organizations like the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, that's going to be helping funders think about outside of government how to balance some of the needs near term. But unfortunately, what's going to happen long after many of the national media attention wanes, but the recovery still is pressing forward.
And last question for you. Obviously, one can't stop these type of natural disasters from happening, but I know that the Biden-Harris administration is working to work on preventative measures, like preparing for if something was to happen like this in one's community. Can you speak to how households, particularly Black and poor households and faith-based organizations, can improve the safety and security of their homes and their facilities as we look ahead.
Absolutely. One of my colleagues, Monica Sanders from the Undivide Project, has written 2 blogs about this, about at the individual level, some practical things that you can do to be best prepared for storms. I'd say the first thing that I would recommend is to know your risk. And so if you are in the South, you may know that there are floods, there's tornadoes, there's hurricanes. We are in the middle of a spring severe weather season. So we're likely going to see more severe weather storms. And so understanding and knowing your risk is an important key. If you go to ready.gov, that is the one-stop shop that provides all of the information that we have from FEMA, and it covers risk from tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, unfortunately, to active shooter. If we're talking about understanding your risk from the place of a business owner, or maybe you're a pastor or a faith leader listening to this, at FEMA.gov/faith, we have a number of resources and tools specifically for those private nonprofits and for those faith leaders that are looking to secure their facilities and to know what to do in case of a man-made incident or in case of another natural disaster. Last thing that Monica would say, because I know she's been very focused on helping to close the digital divide, is we recognize that the solutions for preparedness cannot solely rely on technology. It plays an integral part, but some of the key things that you just want to have on paper, I'd say list of medications, if possible. So that way, again, we have folks in Mississippi that might have lost access to their medications, but having a paper copy of those medications is incredibly helpful. And then making sure that you have key contact numbers written down somewhere. I still have my phone book that my mom used to use. I have my own version of it, so I have some key numbers written down there. We want to make sure that people have some important documents on paper and that they can access documents electronically if necessary, if they're impacted by the storm, like the storms that we've seen in Mississippi.